Team India cannot be stopped in this year's chess Olympiad. They are currently 8 out of 8, giving them a total of 16 possible points. Totally flawless right now. I don't even think that anyone on their team, any board, has lost a game so far. So they're looking pretty untouchable. Their team just has so much depth in them. Every single player, 2,700 plus, and on fiery form. I've got two games that I would like to cover in today's video, that being from Gukesh and Arjun today. I always like giving some light on Arjun because I feel like he's definitely been previously underappreciated, having to make this entire push to the top 5, just farming open tournaments basically, which is really impressive. I don't think any of the top guys ever want to play in open tournaments because they can all attest that you're basically just getting your rating points stolen from loads of other underrated players, and there's this weird club at the very top where they all just play each other and trade rating points. So it's definitely got kind of a different ecosystem at the very top, and I'd be really interested to see how Arjun does in these invitation only tournaments in the future. But let's move on from the preamble and get into some of the games. So, starting with the game between Iranian Grandmaster Bardiya Daneshvar, who has had a pretty fantastic tournament so far in the Olympiad. He's been undefeated, a couple draws, but as we're about to see, that's all going to change. Playing the monster himself, Arjun who cannot be stopped this event. He's only drawn one game against a very strong Chinese player last round. Otherwise, he would have been flawless. Still, a 3,011 performance is pretty incredible. But anyway, we see knight to f3, starting with Areti, potentially hinting at a slightly more quiet setup. But now after d5, g3, knight f6, pretty normal stuff. We see anything but a quiet setup. Arjun's going c5 and d5, taking the full center with his pawns. And Bardiya playing pretty cagey on this side of the board, not taking any center space and saying, I'm going to attack you later. After I let you build your big center, I'm going to tear that right down. So we do see castles e6 and c4, like I said. Striking in the center, you don't really want to take this pawn because it's a big liability. You can just play knight a3, white will collect it, and of course there is no b5, one because the knight could take that, but also knight e5, as always, picks up the rook pretty much. You'd have to play something horrible like knight d5, but now, this is just terrible. So anyway, you can't take that c-pawn. We do see d4, d3, and the knight comes out to c6 for Arjun. Now, Arjun's plan is he wants to try and take a lot of center space, clamp down, play a bit like the engine really, and then just go from there. And meanwhile, white wants to either fight back in the center or try and play for these kind of b4 and a3 pawn pushes on the queen side and really chip away at the black blockade that has been built. We see knight d7, a pretty normal move, going for e5 here, and potentially f6, although you would generally see the bishop on e6 before knight d7 gets played. Knight goes out to a3, I guess going for knight c2, and he's supporting all of the center pawn pushes and flank pawn pushes. But Arjun wants to keep building his big center, and we see a pretty odd knight move to the edge of the board. This does unleash the bishop down this diagonal, and potentially the knight would want to go to f5. This is restricting the development of the bishop, because wherever the bishop would go, say if you play bishop d6, all of a sudden knight to f5 hits the bishop and the pawn, and the bishop has to return all the way home lest the pawn be captured. So knight h5, knight h4, a very interesting move from Bardiya. We see a capture in the center. Takes back with the e-pawn, and now there is kind of this weakness on d3, which you want to thrust forward and try and get all the way to d5, but if you can't do that, then this is always going to be a little bit of a liability. Knight returns to f6 now, so the knight has done its job guarding this center pawn, but now that there is no more pressure in the center. It returns to f6, potentially to escort a pawn push in the future down the middle. Also, bishop now sees f5, so you can simply develop to e7 and castle. Knight b5, bishop g4 attacks the queen, queen to b3, and the players continue making some pretty natural moves. White puts a knight in the center, and Arjun plays bishop to e7 to castle. I'm not really sure why bishop e7 was given an exclamation mark, to be honest with you. Any other move here looks pretty crazy, but bishop to e7 is a good move. Looking to castle, bishop d2, rook comes to the center, and this position looks okay for white. I can't really tell you why black is considerably better, but guess what? Arjun can. He's attacking this knight in the middle and trying to force pawn to e4, which is a huge concession, giving up the d4 square. So we do see e4, and the knight jumps into this center, supported by the two pawns very nicely here, and is just pretty monster piece. Queen c3, an exchange, bishop goes out, and then Arjun grabs the pony on the side of the board. Apparently the only move really to stay in the game for Bardiya was something like knight to f5, which is a difficult move to play considering the possibility of like exchanges here, and it looks like the pawns get all shattered, so definitely already an unpleasant position for Bardiya. He goes a little bit wrong with bishop to e3. He wants to exchange for this really powerful knight, but Arjun simply damages the pawns on the king side and lashes out with f5. This is what I love so much about Arjun's play. He knows the right time to strike. He's always there, always has the time to invest in the critical decisions, and he even made this one fairly quickly. 3 minutes on capturing the knight with the bishop and coming up with pawn to f5. And, Bardiya just captures in the center. Arjun takes back. Queen goes to c5. And now the game is already technically over. Just this f pawn is so strong. It's pushing down the board. He just plays f4. And b6 attacks the queen, hits it back. And f3. The pawn is marching. Bishop back to h5, a nice move, making way for the queen to come into the game. King goes to h1 and a rook lift. Arjun just doesn't stop. The rooks are lifting. They're coming into the game probably via g6 and h3 and rook to c8. So Arjun making threats on the king's side, bringing rooks to the queen's side for an infiltration. You're just getting squeezed on all angles. Now that this pawn's gone to h3, there's forever pressure and the bishop's stuck on f1. So the queen returns to d2. Arjun does in fact play rook g6. There's all kind of rook g3 ideas now. Very nasty stuff. Rook goes to the c file offering exchange. Arjun says, no exchange for you. I'm going to keep my rook on the board and use it to bludgeon you down at the king's side. Queen goes to b4, h6, very sensible move by Arjun, creating a little bit of luft so that now this other rook can participate without risk of the king getting checkmated. Bardiya stacks up on the c-file, f2 now, creating more avenues for the bishop to get re-involved in the game. Rook to c7 and rook to g1. This is the finishing touch. Very classy finish from Arjun after the king moves. Rook takes f1, sacrificing the queen temporarily so that the rook can be captured on c1, and there is no stopping the promotion here, and white simply has no play in the meantime, which is just going to leave Arjun up a rook and a bishop with a checkmating attack to come in a few moves. There's really nothing to do here. Let's say you try queen e7, going for a little cheap checkmate. Guess what? Absolutely savage stuff. There's a promotion to a pony. The king goes to g2, knight e3, king g3, rook g1, king h2, rook g2, rook g2, not rook f2, and then rook f1. So that could have happened in the game. I don't know if Arjun would have played that, or maybe he would have gone for the rook sacrifice so after like queen e7, maybe he would have gone for the rook sacrifice on h1 and just promote to a queen. This is definitely the simplest, but something tells me Arjun would have under-promoted to a knight if this had happened. But okay, let's move on to the game between Parham Maghsoodloo, a very strong top Iranian player, and Gukesh, who has once again, just like Arjun, been an absolute monster this tournament. 3,085 performance rating from, that's just crazy. He's basically won all his games against the board ones from the other countries. He's up 20 rating points right now, and I believe he's just a couple points behind. He's like 28. He's like 2884. Arjun's like 2892. Both of them are coming up on the rears of Fabiano and Hikaru, really pressing down. And yeah, it would be really cool to see if these guys can break 2800 in the near future. But anyway, Parham starts with d4, d5, c4, queen's gambit, and we see the very aggressive Tarash defense from Gukesh. Now, I would be interested to know whether or not this is his World Championship preparation. Something tells me it's probably not, but definitely, it's always interesting to see these players who are going for World Championship, what they're playing before the match, because they probably don't want to give away too much to his opponent, coming opponent Ding. Otherwise, that could be quite useful in preparing. Anyway, we see a capture in the center, another capture, knight goes to f3, and black is very likely to try to end up getting an isolated pawn, queen pawn in this position, which used to be thought to be very bad for the black pieces, but as modern engines have shown, there's always enough counterplay for black to equalize using the open files around the isolated pawn that will be created in the future. So the knight goes to f6, we see a fianchetto setup, and the isolated queen pawn has been reached, no longer just hanging pawns. This isolated queen's pawn, Gukesh will now have to live with possibly for the rest of the game, unless he can shove it down the board potentially or create play around it. We see bishop c5, knight b3. This is pretty common theory after bishop b6, castles, and d4. I've had this position a couple of times with the white pieces. Knight a4 is normal, castles, and rook to e1, h6, bishop f4. Generally, I think when I play this, I take, but that's not very good. I just like to get the bishops, but definitely bishop to f4 is the top move. Bishop goes to e6, knight c5, attacking the bishop. Eventually, white wants to claim one of these two bishops here, or both, ideally, and have these bishops versus knights, and should be doing quite well. But Gukesh plays bishop to d5, now offering an exchange of the light squared bishops. If the light squared bishops come off, then black should be doing well, because this beast is no longer tearing down on this queenside pawn, and the b7 pawn is safe. However, what is strange about this position is that the knight can in fact capture this b7 pawn, although it looks very risky to do it right now, with the fact that the queen can possibly move up probably to e7 is what Parham didn't like, and it looks like the knight doesn't have many retreat squares. Even after knight takes and pawn takes, this knight is pretty blocked out. And if something like knight d6, there's bishop g2, and I guess knight d5 goes after this bishop here, so now this knight would be getting loose, and if the knight were to move away, even something like queen e4, f3, knight takes on f4, and queen f4, and black is left with a considerably better position. The white king is super weak. So Parham probably doesn't like the look of that queen e7 line. He captures first, and then does in fact grab the pawn on b7, going for the high-risk strategy here. Gukesh plays queen d7. The queen no longer needed on e7 to protect the c5 square, because the pawn is now doing that job rather than the bishop. Parham does find pawn to e4, the only move to stay in the game. Once again, knight to d6 wouldn't work because of bishop takes on g2, king g2, and now in this situation, even pawn g5 to kick away the bishop. There's no e5 square covered by the knight. So he does have to find pawn e4, which he does, and after a capture on e3, he goes rook e3. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, I don't really understand why rook e3 is a mistake. Fe3, the move that Gukesh did play in the game, knight to b4, is supposedly not as strong in this line. I don't really get it. I guess it's because maybe the queens can be exchanged, but honestly, I just don't understand the difference between having a rook or a pawn on e3. I don't think Parham really understood why having a pawn there is so much better than the rook. It just seems unintuitive. You are isolating a pawn. It seems positionally wrong, but supposedly taking with the rook is a mistake. And Gukesh punishes it somehow. He plays knight to b4, which is the logical move. Either way, you guard the bishop here in the center with the two knights and the queen. And after knight to d6, we do see bishop g2, king g2, and Gukesh starts stacking up the cannons down the d file. He wants to move his queen out of the way, possibly play g5, and then win this pony here. Rook goes to b3, attacking the knight. The knight moves to the center. And now this knight over here is looking very, very vulnerable in terms of the number of squares it can go to. Bishop to e5, the only move was played by Parham. If you were to try and move this knight out of the way, there's knight takes on f4 check, and the queen would drop. At least you'd lose a full rook. So bishop goes to e5, getting out of the way of knight to f4 stuff, because then bishop would just take. So the queen moves to e6, now attacking all the pieces, putting a lot of pressure on. If the bishop would have returned to f4, then you can just capture with check and then win the knight. So the queen has to go to d4, and things are just looking very, very congested and clogged up over here. We've kind of got like the stealth bomber of all the pieces set up like this. As you can see, the stealth bomber traveling in this direction. But the knight goes to g4 from Gukesh, attacking the knight. The winning move here was rook to d6, which I would have thought looks pretty obvious, especially considering Gukesh just had this amazing game where he had the two knights outplaying the single rook. But maybe he just didn't like his winning chances that much after something like, I don't know, rook d1, queen c6. Still looks pretty good. Look at these nasty discoveries. But I guess after the king goes back to g1, he might not have been super optimistic about his chances to win a 3 versus 3 with the two knights. Although, given the prestige that he's earned after yesterday's game, I think it would have been pretty nice to go for this. But anyway, he goes for knight to g4, which is concretely actually does win significant material. He does win a piece at the expense of a bunch of pawns. After the rook goes here, he drops his knight back to e7, and you have to play bishop takes on g7. If you play bishop to f4, there's g5, and the pony is kind of dropping off. Let's say you retreat. There's even this move, knight to c8, exploiting the pin, or possibly knight to f5 as well would get the job done. But we do end up seeing this move, bishop g7, and now knight to f5, attacking the bishop and attacking the queen here. Nice stuff from Gukesh. He goes up a piece, but is now down a bunch of pawns. f5 from Gukesh, solidifying his pony in the center. Now we see h3, trying to kick it right back. Knight goes to e5, which I do like. It controls the f3 square, and if you can ever deliver a check, like on a8 or some other square, then this will be very, very dangerous for the white king. However, Parham tries to get a little bit fancy with it, playing the move knight to c4, and Gukesh just captures that knight. And now, so Parham's idea behind this move was that he could trade the rooks and then take the knight, and it looks like he's sort of liquidating here and starting a little bit of an attack. If you were to just say grab this pawn lazily, then the move rook to b8 exchanges off a bunch of pieces, and it's actually white who might even be pressing a little bit, although this is probably just a draw. You can't do a whole lot with this knight and two pawns versus the nice three white pawns and potential passed b pawn. But Gukesh, ever accurate, plays the only move, rook to d1, even though it's very, very logical. He wants to go queen f1, queen h1, and try and start dragging the white king, kicking and screaming, out of his little castle. So the rook comes back to b3, going for a defensive role. There's really not a whole lot you can do here. This check is futile. The king just hides on h7, and this fianchettoed knight here is doing an excellent job defending the f5 pawn. So instead of rook to b1, Parham brings the rook back, but now queen f1, queen h1, and rook d5 sends Parham to resign the game. The queen is defending the rook from here, and if you do deliver a check like this, just king to h7, and there is nothing to do. If the queen moves anywhere, knight to h5. Actually, no. e7's one of the only squares where the knight can't move. If the queen moves somewhere random, actually, that also defends h5. If the queen moves somewhere like f6, then I'm trying to point out that knight to h5 will be a checkmate with queen to e4. And alternatively, if you do go to pin this knight here, then I guess queen c1 will probably checkmate the king in a couple moves. I don't see the exact mate. Let's say queen c1, king f3, rook d3, king g2. I guess the king is being hunted. g4. I mean, honestly, yeah, I'm struggling to see it. There is clearly enough pieces to checkmate the white king, and actually the queen. There's nothing more to do after queen f2 is a threat, and queen h1. So this double threat of mate here does simply end the game on the spot. Actually, you end up having to give a lot of spike checks, and this is just pointless. In fact, that hangs a rook. So anyway, if you guys did enjoy this coverage of the Chess Olympiad, 2 excellent games played by the Indian prodigies, do please consider liking and subscribing, or leave a comment on what other games you would like me to cover. And as always, I'll see you guys in another video. Bye.